you're saying words
That's
don't
how it,
exist,
it became into
but
being.
they come into being, and then after enough people in society accept them as,
Accept them.
yeah,
Yeah.
they become a word that exists kind of in reality. Yeah.
Yeah, like YOLO or
Yeah.
the slang of a different community.
Yeah. That
It's
even.
a reality amongst them,
Yeah.
but maybe to some other people, even in the same language, doesn't mean anything. Welcome back to Out of the Box podcast, where Steele and I, your hosts, get to talk about outside of the box ideas. Before we actually even start, I want to invite you to give us a like down below. Also, subscribe to our channel because we are completely committed to continue providing awesome content outside of the box ideas to boggle your mind. So, without further ado, Steele, you said you had a theory about war and if
About
wars
word.
existed. So I mean,
No. Yeah, it's about words.
oh, words.
Yeah,
I thought you
words.
meant war. Let's see. Let's see.
Yeah, yeah.
Words exist.
Yeah, so words,
That's
right? So, man, my friend's gonna be mad because like me and him disagreed heavily on this. So like I think it's crazy, right? So I think words, what are words? What are they, right? So they're these little black symbols on paper. If you have a piece of paper that has words on it, well, you break it down into its components, right? So it's just, we call them letters that are put next to each other and that make words, right? And a certain combination of those letters means that this is a different word from this word. But when you break it down, it's just a piece of paper which is made from tree, and then it's ink that's put on the paper in a certain pattern, right, to form a letter, which is put next to another pattern, which is another letter, right? So
mm-hmm.
in that sense, do the words really exist, right? So words, we could say, like, they mentally exist. They exist in our mind because we perceive the ink on the paper in that shape as a word. So mentally and psychologically, the word exists. My argument is just that words don't physically exist, right? So because when you break it down, it's just ink, paper. If we're looking at my computer screen, it's just pixels being projected by various electronic mechanism. It's just an illusion. It's not really there. I don't know. What do you think? Like, first thoughts?
uh it's interesting. It's interesting because it made me think of one thing, like for example, um can we say that wind exists even though sometimes you know we can hear it, sometimes we can feel it,
Yeah, it's a good
you
one.
know sometimes it's like you see the dust flying, sometimes you can see it. It makes me think of that, like too, like it's not something tangible that you can say like it's it exists but it's there. And I guess that's something more like natural.
You can't see it.
But you know I guess words are something that is humanly created, right?
That's another thing.
Like, and it makes me think like, well, maybe what about in a parallel universe, what we consider as a language here is just blabber, with them, or how about extraterrestrial,
Yeah, like
beings?
that movie
Like we
Arrival.
won't be able to communicate the same way because
Yeah,
they have maybe a different language. So to them, we're just saying, stuff, like we're making sounds, like dogs make sounds, like birds make sounds. They communicate amongst themselves and understand themselves. But we've basically made a way of categorizing different things or giving certain patterns of sounds to associate them with a particular object. And so that object, because it's happened before in cultures, even cross cultures, sometimes people say, well, this is bread, but then in Spanish it's pan. So
right.
who's right, the English or the Spanish? And so, but they both refer to the same thing though. And so it's interesting how with so many different languages, it's still the same object. It's still the same, physical thing, but it just has a different name depending on the language that you use.
Yeah, and the
So that's very interesting.
yeah, have you seen that movie Arrival?
Yes, yeah,
Uh,
with with
yeah,
the aliens. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, they had a circular language, and why did they
Uh-huh.
have that? Because their time was non-linear. Their time went forwards and backwards at the same time, so like their language was based on
Mm.
their symbols, if you will, like the ink they shot out
Oh,
that forms a letter or a word or a sentence.
yeah.
Yeah,
So we're able to communicate in 2D form, right? And
yeah,
since they were in the fourth dimension, they could go
yeah, outside
above or below time, then
3D.
they could communicate through the three-dimensional
Yeah,
world.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's what's
very
interesting
interesting.
about it. Well, yeah, and like you said, words are 2D. They're just ink on paper. They're pixels on a computer monitor. And in our mind interprets those patterns and then forms it into what we call a word. And we learn that as a child growing up. And there are critical periods. So it's not like the brain has some level of genetic predispositions for language and for understanding words.
Yeah,
But once that critical period of development is passed, they say a child can no longer learn words like to read,
yeah,
write, to speak. And that's actually been shown
yeah.
as a child who was deprived of that. And she was never,
Hmm.
they tried so hard to get her to learn words, but they
Yeah,
barely could get her to learn anything.
I've heard of that. Yeah, that they deprived her from, like, it was like the special case where somebody held her away from society or something.
Yeah, exactly. Feral children, children who
Yeah.
grew up in the wild, same thing.
Hmm.
So, and when I think of it like that, it's like it seems like the words are mostly psychological. It doesn't mean they're not important, and it doesn't mean we can't use them as tools. It just means
Yeah.
physically, do they really physically exist, or is what physically exists the ink and the paper? I guess that's the question. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it makes me think like, right now that you were mentioning about the capacity to speak or communicate in 2D, right? Like written word and stuff like that. It makes me think like, well, are we capable of communicating in the fourth dimension?
Yeah, if we could,
Is that what prayer is? It makes me think of that. I know we've had a
that's
podcast about that, so don't want to get too much into it, but
yeah, but briefly, that is true. Like, if you could, maybe prayers do pass that barrier into the fourth dimension, and where we could say God or a higher power could exist, then maybe that's how that works. You know,
mhm.
but yeah, fourth
Yeah,
dimension
but
language, yeah, that's weird too.
yeah, because you know, kind of like you said, the movie Arrival. Well, they communicated, through these circular objects. Well, do those circular objects exist? Maybe like you said, the pen and or the pencil and the paper do exist,
Yeah,
but even the words that we use to refer to them, do those exist? And
yeah,
I think they exist within our reality. I think that's what it is. Maybe it exists within one's personal reality or one's general reality amongst people. Because let's say, for example, if a tree falls in the forest, did it really fall if only one person saw it?
yeah. Does this?
Or if no one saw it at all, did it really fall?
Yeah, does
You
something
know,
still
it's kind of
exist?
like that idea. So if it has to be amongst a group of people that they accept it to be true in order to exist, right? Like, let's say, for example, if nobody knew, let's say I created a version of Mickey Mouse and we call them um chicken chicken soup or something. And and it was a famous chicken, but nobody knew about it. Only I did. You know, does it really exist? well, maybe I can say in my personal reality it does, but to other people it doesn't, you know?
Yeah, and they would
And
never.
so like let's say the word like Shakespeare, he made up a lot of words that are now I think in the dictionary. And so when he started releasing them, people could have context clues of like maybe what that word could mean, right? And so, but then it became generalized to the point where now it's in the dictionary,
So yeah,
right?
you're saying words
So
don't
now it,
exist,
it became into
but
being,
they come into being, and then after enough people in society accept them as,
accept them.
yeah,
Yeah.
become a word that exists kind of in reality. Yeah.
Yeah, like YOLO
Yeah,
or the slang of a different community. You
yeah,
know, they
that
it's
even.
a reality amongst them,
Yeah.
but maybe to some other people, even in the same language, doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, and I would argue that further supports the argument that words are just psychological. They're, because another thing I can think of, a metaphor. If you had a dog and the dog looked at a piece of paper that you wrote words on, well, what's the dog gonna see? They're just gonna see, let's say use a pencil, they're gonna see pencil marks on a piece of paper. They're not gonna know what it says, what it means.
Mhm.
So like it's like human beings, well, at the very least, even farther than that, human beings that are taught, that have gone through kindergarten and elementary school to understand and be able to read words, to understand those symbols on that paper, can see a word, but the dog or someone who never learned words cannot see a word. So does that, what does that mean? That's an interesting question.
Yeah. And it's true, like some dogs have been trained to react based on different verbal cues or words even that one says. And it's interesting because they pay really good attention at what we do. Like, sometimes if we wear running shoes, they get excited because they think we're gonna go on a run or something. They realize different cues.
They learn, yeah.
So it's nonverbal, and so that's how they learn to communicate, right? But you know using like referring back to words, I think it's just the same thing. It's just social cues. It's just ways or organized ways of communicating in a mass group, right? Just for classification, right? I know we talked about this, that we just have a human tendency to classify things, to put names to things, right? And so I think it's our way to organize what we actually see in our personal reality, right?
Yeah.
If we discover a new element, we automatically want to put a name to it, right? But why?
Yeah.
Why put a name to an element? Well, it's to classify it to so
Yeah.
that you can refer back to it.
So we can all be on the same page. And I think classifying things is the only way we can figure out how to understand reality. Because if we don't
Yeah,
classify things, I feel like it becomes chaos, like, I mean, you can
yeah,
imagine if we just got rid of all classifications right now, categories, just in general, the
yeah,
chaos that would happen. There'd be no organization, like you said.
yeah. And I
And
think I think through classification, we've become a more peaceful world to a certain degree. People can argue that. But it's because before people, different clans had different ways of communicating. You had all these dialects, different dialects. So you couldn't communicate with them. So what do? You either kill them or you get killed because one culture or one way of living has to remain above the other, right? To a certain degree, right? And so I think that was interesting, back then, how the differences in language affected, you know, how other clans or groups of people became peaceful to each other or not. And so,
they had a physical effect in that sense on the world.
mhm,
It's interesting because I think words can have a physical effect on the world, even if they don't physically exist, even if it is psychological, because then psychological things can turn into physical behaviors that cause physical things, like,
yeah,
so like the words we tell other people can affect them. And
yeah,
had scientific studies show like the same centers in the brain that light up when you feel physical pain also light up when you are having emotional pain. So if like someone says like mean words to you or like bullying or like anything really like, just
You have a
yells
negative
at you,
connotation.
yeah, screams at you or yells at you, demeans you, makes you feel bad, it can light up the same brain area that feels physical pain. So it's like that's interesting how these words can have some kind of physical effect on the brain. It's weird.
Yeah. And if words don't exist, and if they are just like letters on a paper, then it wouldn't be able to do that. But words do exist, I guess, to a general group. Because if I said bloppity blop blop, right? Well, what does that mean? That doesn't even give you a negative or positive connotation. It doesn't register on your uh your sense of reality, right? It doesn't refer back to anything that is has been classified, right? And so in that sense, the sounds to create the word that I just mentioned, they do exist, but the word itself does not exist in our general sense of reality.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, like physically, like I think that's what you're saying too. Like it psychologically exists because it has a psychological effect. And I think that psychological effect, the word psychologically exists, right? So they have a psychological effect, right? And so that can lead to physical effects. So it starts in the mind, it starts with a psychological effect. And then when you speak the word out loud, it has a psychological effect on someone else. Like the example we said, like someone says mean words to someone, well, then that psychologically is taken in, and the word, because the word psychologically exists, because we interpret it psychologically with our mind, and then it leads to a physical effect. But just because it leads to a physical effect does that mean the word becomes in physical existence? And it's interesting because then physical words on paper can also lead to psychological interpretations of those words. So physical effect leads to psychological effect in that sense, but then psychological effect of saying the words leads to physical effect in the brain. So it gets confusing when you dive deeper.
Yeah.
Pretty
And
confusing.
even you can even have a combination of words that do exist, but then make um combine them, right? Like sometimes people, when they write songs, they combine, different words, or they switch out the spelling, to sound like freight with an 8 in the middle or something like that, or I don't know, like they create words that don't exist, or that are a combination of what words that we do have, but then they make something new off of it, you know? And I think it's almost like, and I think that's why they teach it in the liberal arts, or the arts. They consider a language an art as well, because in itself we have to come up with it on the spot, right? And how we phrase our words, sometimes we can say the same thing but phrase it a different way, and it can have a totally different meaning,
Yeah.
right? And so I think, that's why people study how to give speeches, how to write speeches, how to speak to people, because different words can awaken different feelings in people, and so that your message gets carried off the way that you want it to be, you have to be careful on how you kind of mold your sentences and stuff like that. So I think it in itself, it is an art form, that is, like you said, psychologically created, because at the end of the day, it does affect how we see the world, right? I think it goes back to the idea of, I think we mentioned it one time in this podcast, that there was a Native American, group of people that could see like 56 shades of green. They could identify 56 shades of green. I think they said that, normally we can identify about roughly about 7 different shades of green. And so they could
Uh,
see different shades of green, and they could notice them. And so, and they could, because they had a name for that shade of green, and since they had a name for that shade of green, they could see that shade of green. And
Yeah,
so it's so interesting that words sometimes create our personal reality and what we're able to perceive in the
yeah.
world.
My final word on that is, yeah, that makes me think. Psychologically, words do like affect you in serious ways. Like if someone says words to themselves, negative self thoughts, we call them, all the time, then they're keeping their own depression alive, and that could even lead to suicide. So it's like it can lead to a physical consequence. So words can lead to physical consequences, and we use them all the time. So I'll leave it with
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah. Well, let us know, guys. What do you think? Do words exist? Did we make an interesting conversation for you? Let us know down below. Write down your comments. We would love to know what's going on, what you think, and also down below, please subscribe to our channel so that you can continue to receive some amazing content, and also hit that bell icon so that you can also be notified when we release our weekly shows. And without further ado, we'll talk to you soon. So take care.